Time for Game Talk.
It is time for another episode of Game Talk. And, you may notice, of course, the Golden Stallion here with you, you may notice that it doesn't fall under the Sovereign Tech subscriber episode numbering. That is because Game Talk, I more or less consider on the Patreon feed to be a completely separate podcast. Of course, also after this episode, it's going to have video as well. In fact, I already have the episode lined up, and I'll put it this way. So first off, got great response from the first episode of Game Talk. Of course, that is to take the place of the Game Talk segment getting removed from the Sovereign Tech Prime episode and being put into being its own series on the Patreon feed for Sovereign Tech. Got great response from that. I will say, like, when I first I've never done a video show, not like a full on, like where there's, production done within the video show. My first few outings with that, be patient with me, because that is something that requires editing. There's a lot to it. It's not something I'm going to do live. It's nothing like that. But there's work involved, and video editing is not exactly my strong suit. But I should say not yet. But I think it will be. So, because fuck, I'm me. I'm the man of tomorrow. I can do anything. Anyway, so really excited for this, and it sounds like a lot of the patrons are as well, and hopefully this will inspire new patrons to jump on, because I know a lot of people really enjoy Game Talk in the Sovereign Tech Prime episode. Not that I'm taking it away because of a lack of popularity, not at all. I just need... I really can't go beyond 2 hours. I know there's people who have told me, they say, hey, have Sovereign Tech go 4 hours. If I had the time of day, I would. If anything, I've actually had recent conversations with some of the, should we call it the Sovereign Tech production team, to even talk about perhaps having Sovereign Tech, be a little bit shorter or something like that, but playing with shorter formats anyway. And that's certainly what we're doing here with Game Talk. Don't worry, that's not something I would do without talking to the patrons first, because ultimately you're the ones that need to be pleased, with the direction that things are going. And I consider the Sovereign Tech patrons to be executive producers. So, you would have say if that decision were actually happening, but I needed room to put in another segment. And so now you have Game Talk in the Patreon feed, just another show that you get access to just for being a Sovereign Tech patron, and really adds to what ends up being pretty much daily content. Like I said, this is another episode where, and I told you this in the first episode of Game Talk, that the first couple episodes would be available to all patrons, as to where once it goes to video, then, there will be video and an audio version as well. But once it goes to video, it will be only for the dilettantes, so the Triple Black Arts and above. It'll only be for the $5 level and above. So be ready for that. When that happens, you're wondering, hey, where is there another Game Talk? Well, you got to be at the higher levels to get access to it. But this is one that I promised for a little while, so I don't want to put it behind too big of a paywall, or too tall of a paywall, should I say. And so I want to talk about it here. And that is the Commodore 64 Mini, or technically it's the C64 Mini. And in fact, the C64 is all one word, probably to get past various copyright issues. So the C64 Mini, or the Commodore 64 Mini, obviously is a re-release taking advantage of the recent retro console craze, which I am certainly all in on that craze. In fact, I just recently got my international version of the Neo Geo Mini. Now, that's a point to bring up quickly, is that the C64 Mini did not go with, it was originally released in May of 2018 throughout the rest of the world, and you could have bought it at any point then. I waited until it got to the United States officially, where I was expecting maybe they would call it the C64 Classic when it came here, because that seems to be what Nintendo is doing, like the The SNES Mini or the SNES Mini it's called the SNES Mini in other parts of the world, but then in America it's called the SNES Classic. Or like the NES Mini, it's called the NES Mini everywhere else, but then in America it's called the NES Classic. They didn't follow that trend, neither did Neo Geo, or neither did SNK, I should say. That they decided to just keep it listed as the Mini. Obviously, that makes packaging a lot easier, but it didn't get released officially in the United States until the second week of October. I think the official date might have been October 9th that it came out. It's done by a company, Retro Games Limited, out of Europe, and it would appear that they've worked with a German manufacturer for that, and I'll explain more of why I know that. This is, again, a re-release, a smaller re-release of effectively the Commodore 64 from 1982. It is about a third the size of the original Commodore 64. Most people recognize the Commodore 64 when they see it, where it's the computer that's inside of the keyboard. And of course, they'd have a bunch of different add-on features and everything. This has the ability to have a bunch of add-ons, but there's no real add-ons here with the C64 Mini. Also, the keyboard on it, the little keyboard, doesn't actually work. Honestly, I get that it's impractical if it did, and it probably would have doubled the price if they made it a working keyboard. But I think they kind of dropped the ball on the keyboard not working. Even though, if you're like me, and you don't have, kind of the pointy fingers like some guys do, or, people do. I have these ridiculous man hands. Not that I could have typed very well with it, just like I can't type very well on a touch keyboard, like on a smartphone. But I feel like it would have been pretty cool if it did. And a lot of reviewers have said that the first thing anybody does when they see the C64 Mini, which is bigger than the palm of my hand, which is actually a first for a lot of these retro consoles, is usually they're so small. Granted, I do have large hands, but they're usually smaller than my hand. This one is not. It's long. But the first thing that people do when they see it is they press on the keys to see if the keyboard works. Even if it didn't do anything, maybe I would have at least allowed the keys to move. But it could have had a function with it moving. Not that you can't connect a keyboard to it anyway. Certainly they had thought about that. Retro Games Limited had. So the C64 Mini, it comes with the unit itself, which has a total of 4 ports on it, and it has one button, which is just a power button that you power it on with, or that you hold down for it to shut down. It has 2 USB ports. I think they're just stock USB 2.0 ports. It has a micro USB female connector at the back, which is what powers it, and you could just plug it in with a USB. Any power brick that your smartphone comes with would work, or you could just plug it right into the television, along with the 4th port on it, which is an HDMI, a full-size HDMI port. This is something that I actually ran into with the Neo Geo Mini. I didn't realize, I didn't even pay any attention. I just wanted to make sure that I got my hands on it. I didn't realize that it needed a micro HDMI or mini HDMI port. Well, that's what it had for connecting to a television, even though the Neo Geo Mini actually has its own screen on it, a little 2-inch screen. Talking about, getting ahead of itself. It looks like a little arcade cabinet, right? But going that extra mile as to where, like I said, the C64 Mini, I think it would have been a real advantage if it went the extra mile and actually allowed the keys to at least move, if not actually be functional, something that you could type with. And it would do something on whatever program you had open. But yeah, the Neo Geo Mini actually has like a 2-inch screen on it that you could play the games on, and a little joystick and buttons and everything. It's kind of an all-in-one unit, even though it does come with a gamepad. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I didn't realize that it had that. Also, it uses a USB-C to power, not micro USB. Really, SNK was, I don't know. I'm not sure what they were thinking, but they were definitely thinking, it feels like they were thinking somewhat ahead, and that this is something to go the distance. But my review of the Neo Geo Mini that we're here for the C64, that will be coming soon. So anyway, back to the Commodore, or to the C64 Mini, the Commodore 64 Mini, even though technically that's not its name. So it has those 4 ports. It comes with a joystick, which is, a lot of people don't realize the Commodore 64 was popular from 1982 well into the 90s, its glory years were pretty much from like 83 to say 86. Like it had 3 years where it was just positively fucking dominant. But it was still a big deal well into the 90s, you know, even though Commodore was replacing it with the various Amiga computers. The Commodore 64 was still the stuff. In fact, the Commodore 64 to this day is still used at some garages. There's a garage in Poland. It was interesting that it still uses a Commodore 64 for, you know, just about everything around the garage. I mean, it's amazing, you know, automobile garage or, you know, auto repair garage. But suffice to say, it was dominant for a very, very long time, even though it was never like the most powerful computer out there. In fact, 64, I think some people think maybe, you know, people a little bit younger would think that the 64 was like the Nintendo 64, where it stood for 64-bit, you know, as in like the graphics processor. No, it stands for 64K, which is like all the memory the system had. It was, as far as games go, it's an 8-bit system, just like the NES, and. Well, anyway, so my point in saying that it was dominant for a really long time and that it was used for a really long time, a lot of different peripherals, a lot of different accessories and add-ons and so on, and a lot of, here's the important point, a lot of different joysticks were made, and official ones at that, were made for the Commodore 64. The joystick that comes with the C64 Mini is one of those quasi-official iterations. And it's also... And it's USB, okay? So since there's 2 USB ports on the C64 Mini, you can plug in that one joystick. Again, it only comes with one. You can plug in that joystick, and then you could plug in a keyboard if you wanted to in the other USB port, or you could plug in another joystick of some type. Now, I've heard varying reports as far as what joysticks will actually work with the C64. Something to bear in mind that the USB ports are also used for is firmware updates. Firmware updates, in fact, when I first got the C64 Mini, it was at version 1.1. I didn't even bother messing with it at version 1.1. I immediately updated it to version 1.4, which was the latest, which I think has some important enhancements that we will talk about as this review goes on. So maybe some of the controllers actually work much better than the review units that the press got, where they said, oh, this controller doesn't work, whatever, as to where, you know, we're up 0.3 iterations of the firmware. I could imagine that some controllers might work better, and they really should, for a couple reasons. One is the most important reason, and it's really the number one negative. We might as well get it out of the way now. The number one negative of the C64 Mini is that the joystick it comes with is shit. I mean, it is bad. Okay, now I know some of the firmware updates were specifically to address issues of the, I would suppose, latency issues of the joystick, but it's not a matter of latency issues. The full-on joystick is, I mean, it just feels sloshy. Like, and it doesn't respond quickly. And, you know, a lot of these games, first off, the Commodore 64 had thousands of games made for it, which allowed for some very strange games and also allowed for some very mainstream games. A lot of mainstream games at the time were, of course, what? Platformers, a very precision type of game, where it requires precision of controls. And this joystick will not give that to you. Not at all. I mean, it's fucking bad. I normally would not complain, and I'd give a lot of credit for, you know, well, I mean, hey, this looks great, this looks perfect, blah, blah, blah. No, this is bad. And to make matters worse, before I even got the C64 Mini, I found who I assume is the German company that Retro Games Limited dealt with when they were, manufacturing the C64 Mini. I found they were selling, and I had to go to eBay. I couldn't get them on Amazon, couldn't get them much of anywhere. eBay was the only place I could find them. I bought a second official the C64 controller. Now, it's important to talk about that for a second. So the system itself costs about $80 for the C64 Mini. A second controller, and let's be clear here, a second shitty controller cost another $35 landed. I'm half tempted to return it. Like, I really am. But then at the same time, I don't know, maybe somehow I mean, I don't know how you can fix this, like, because the stick itself is just sloshy and it's weird to hold. Like, it has these non-slip pads on it that actually do a great job of holding the joystick, onto like a table. But it still just feels so wrong. I mean, there's a lot of buttons on it. I'll give them that. I mean, there's a total of besides the joystick, there's a total of 8 buttons on there. There's 2 triggers where they're evenly placed, so that way if you're left-handed or right-handed, you can still use it fairly well. Then there's 2 minor buttons under that, and then there's the 4 along the back that do various functions, including one main button that no matter what game or software you're using, it will automatically bring up either a virtual keyboard or will exit to the main menu or restart or whatever. Which is handy to have that button, at any given moment. And that was part of the reason why I felt a little bit better about, getting a second controller that at the very least had that ability as well. But again, there's a lot of times where I feel like you're going to want a keyboard in this. And a lot of these games really do appeal more to a lot of what the C64 Mini is offering appeals more to a single player experience anyway, not so much a multiplayer experience, which would certainly be different for the NES Classic and the SNES Classic. Though the Neo Geo Mini, oddly enough, only comes with one controller and everything on there is 2-player. What the fuck were they thinking? You really need to buy a second Neo Geo controller for that. But regardless, with the C64 Mini, you can get away with not having a second controller because, again, a lot of the experiences available on it, and we'll talk more about what availability means, but a lot of the experiences available on it are best at single player. It does come with 64 games built in, a fitting number based upon the name, and also one of the largest libraries to come with any of these systems, as to where the Nintendo iterations have come with anywhere between 20 to 30, and the Neo Geo Mini comes with 40. This is definitely the largest of these quality mini consoles or retro consoles. And I will say this is a quality release. It feels good. The Commodore 64, the C64 Mini itself, other than the keyboard not actually functioning, it feels good. It feels, it's got a little heft to her. The joystick, not so much a quality release, but only in that the joystick itself feels pretty sloshy, like the stick. Everything else about the joystick, about the joypad or whatever, does feel good and looks very legit. It really matches and it definitely gives you that retro feel. But again, it is sloshy and it is a little awkward. If you're not holding it down onto some kind of flat surface, even with my, as I said, man hands, I cannot, it really doesn't feel right holding the joystick in one hand, kind of like you would with an Atari 2600 controller, where you would hold it in one hand and then you'd use the joystick and whatever. This does not work well for that. So controllers are easily the biggest and maybe only problem with this system. And if they come out with some kind of official support, say for Xbox One controllers or something, I think we would end up with a much better experience. And maybe I will update you if I find out that is possible and that has happened. As yet, controller mapping and controllers that are accepted are kind of across the board. Or not across the board. They're kind of all over the place as far as what's possible. So anyway, understand that the controller's going to suck. You can use whatever keyboard you want, and the keyboard works pretty much instantly. I've plugged in a couple different types, and they both worked beautifully. So let's talk about the software. We've talked quite a bit about the hardware. Again, it's a beautiful presentation. I mean, it is pretty badass to just wherever you put the thing, to walk by and just see a little mini Commodore 64. I mean, it's a nostalgia play, no doubt about that, and this is certainly for the nostalgic, which myself included. I had a Commodore 64 when I was very young, and it was I've often said that next to the G4 Cube, it was probably my favorite computer ever. You can find pictures of me speaking at events wearing a Commodore t-shirt. I mean, I wave the Commodore flag, baby. I'm all about it. And so it is pretty cool, I have to admit, to just see a mini Commodore 64, just kind of sitting there on the table. And it's oh, that's nice. I really love that. That's been one of the nicer things about a lot of these retro consoles, is just you look at them and you get instant waves of nostalgia, but then also you feel really cool because, a lot of us, especially in the 90s, a lot of us kids then, we wanted the big shelf under the television that had every console ever, underneath there, every fucking console. Even when we were buying our N64s or hell, even our PlayStation 2s or whatever, we wanted the NES under there. We wanted the Super Nintendo under there. We wanted the Atari Jaguar under there. We wanted them all. And so it is pretty cool, to have like this lineup of consoles that can do all kinds of things. And this, speaking of consoles that can do all kinds of things, this is maybe the most versatile of all of the retro consoles, and it'll probably hold that record. Unless Sega has something really impressive in mind, or Philips actually releases their CDI, I don't think any retro console is going to match this. And I would love it if somebody released like a version of this, of the Commodore 64 or the C64 Mini, and they did it for some of the Atari computers. Hell, even like the Atari ST or something. I mean, that would be amazing, right? But I don't know that that's going to happen. So let's talk about the software. Like I said, we talked about the hardware quite a bit. We'll get into the software here. The software of the C64 Mini is where that versatility really shines. I mean, having 2 USB ports, which is also unique in comparison to other retro consoles, certainly offers some versatility. But the software itself, again, you have 64 games. It's a beautiful menu and presentation. There are a lot of, again, it's 64 games. The selection is interesting. Obviously, with thousands of games that had been produced for the Commodore 64 for pretty much a decade, if not longer. In fact, there's still new Commodore 64 games made to this day. We'll talk about that in a minute. What do you put on there? And because there's thousands, honestly, like if somebody did a top 8, like if I did a top 8 Commodore 64 games, I guarantee you it would be wildly different from any other list you'd find on the internet. And any other list that you'd find on the internet would be wildly different from any other list that you find on the internet, because there's thousands of games to choose from. And some of them are fucking weird, but they're beautiful at the same time, right? And there's some real gems in there that are kind of universally lauded, I think. But at the same time, there's so many games. I mean, everybody's got their favorites. It's not like a simple, you wouldn't think that it would, be that dramatic of a difference, but it's not like the NES where, you have some odd 400 games maybe. And, you can pare down a top 25 pretty easy. You can't do that with the Commodore 64. I mean, there's too many, and there's too many fucking oddballs, because it was so easy to program a game for the Commodore 64. So, it depended really, I think, upon what licensing they could get for what company, that, as far as what showed up on the Commodore 64 itself, but that doesn't exactly matter. Some companies like APPENDIX, they must have gotten a really sweet deal with, because they're out of the 64 games, probably half of them are from, the original game studio APPENDIX, which is fine, because honestly, one of my favorite games for the Commodore 64, that being the Sword of Forgal, is an APPENDIX game, and it's on there. This is as far as what's stock on the system, this is, in my opinion, the game to play. It's an RPG, feels very much like Legend of Zelda before there was a Legend of Zelda, because this came out in 1983, and it is a really, really deep and rich game. I mean, again, we're talking 8-bit graphics, pre-NES 8-bit graphics, right? So, anyway, the graphics are a mixed bag on this, because some games were made later than others, and, you find out all these different ways that you can squeeze more and more abilities into so little code, and so little hardware. But regardless, Sword of Forgal is, this is a game you could kind of play forever if you really wanted to. There is an end to it, but there's just so much depth into this was, in a lot of ways, it was really Dungeons and Dragons finally put onto a computer system. I think about BioWare, right? In fact, like the re-release of Neverwinter Nights, the enhanced edition came out. I was playing that, and boy, that's fucking brilliant. If BioWare made a game for the Commodore 64, and again, BioWare, remember, they made Knights of the Old Republic, Revan, and they also made, Jade Empire. They just made some of the greatest games in history, especially as far as RPGs. If BioWare made a game for the Commodore 64, they would have made the Sword of Forgal. And I don't know how, what greater compliment can you give a game, right? So that's really the winner here, but there's others. Impossible Mission 1 and 2 are on here. Those are a lot of fun. Speedball 1 and 2 are on there. They're a lot of fun. There's some very strange ones that are included, some that I had never played or even heard of. That's easy to happen when you have a history like the Commodore 64 has. So it's a nice selection, and it's a varied selection of games. In fact, I even played really what was more or less a shmup on there. It wasn't Synapse. I'm trying to remember which exact game it was, but anyway, it was fucking hard. Like, it just didn't. And shmups, that's my brand. And, shoot 'em up games. And like, it was too much, it was just too fast. I think it was IO. That's what it was. The game was IO. And, the instant you start playing for the first few seconds, and there's just too many enemies, like instantaneously. Of course, once you get past that first wave of enemies, that only lasts a few seconds, not even, then the game is rather peaceful or by comparison, but it just hammers you at first. And that's the thing. There was no real, like this was, the Commodore 64 was very much the Wild West of gaming. Because there were so many abilities, again, it was so easy to program with, and you had such, at the time, certainly in 1982, you had such amazing hardware to work with at the time. And, even though the hardware wouldn't necessarily improve over time, people kept figuring out how to do more and more things with what would end up becoming limited hardware by the time of 1990 and so on. The games. Bottom line, the games are crazy. But here's the real winner for the C64 Mini. That is that because it has a USB port, you can plug in a FAT32 formatted, flash drive, right? You can load a game on there. Now you have to give the name, and there's a manual and instructions on how to do all this. So, you go to their website, the c64.com. That's the website. And it will, you have to name the file something specific, okay? And it has to be a ROM that is formatted as .d64. That's the file extension, because there's a bunch of different ones. Like there's .c64, .tap. There's a bunch of different ones. It has to be a .d64 for it to work with the C64 Mini. But you can only put one game at a time. But apparently they may fix that. They may make it so that you can do more. They've already fixed some things about loading these games, making it easier. But you could load effectively, if you have a collection of Commodore 64 ROMs, you could put one at a time onto a USB stick, plug it in, and like in the menu, when you have a USB stick plugged in, you will see you can go down and there's a little USB, a graphic of a USB stick. You can click on that. And then you can click on the file and open it up. Now, before version, I think 1.3 of the C64 Mini software, you had to actually go into BASIC, as in, the basic shell, the programming shell. And yes, this is the C64 Mini because it has that shell. It's terminal, which again, the programming language is BASIC. Because it has that, this really is a full-on Commodore 64. Now, I haven't messed around with loading various software on there, but I know other people have, and it works. You can load up software through effectively the terminal on the Commodore 64. You used to have to previously, if you were loading up a game, again, a ROM with the .d64 file extension, you would have to actually put in a bunch of commands into the terminal for it to load up. Okay, as to where now, as of version 1.3, and it's actually up to version, or maybe it's 1.14. Anyway, now that it's up to that, you can actually just click on it by going to the little graphic of the USB key. You don't have to go into BASIC to load the game. Again, only one at a time, but that ability is far superior to what any of these other retro consoles come with out of the box. Yes, I know you can modify them, but I'm saying out of the box and by design. Because of this, now, like I told you, there are still Commodore 64 games made to this day. In particular, one of my favorite publishers is Cytronic Software. I love these guys. And in fact, they just had a relatively new game come out called Organism, and it's effectively the aliens, as in, Ripley, this is the aliens game that we've always wanted. I mean, and it is haunting and it is badass. They have plenty of other games from Cytronic Software, some of which you buy for $5 a pop, like Organism, or they're ones that you can download for free. Now, the nice thing is that Cytronic Software, with a lot of their newer Commodore 64 games, they give you the file already pre-named and formatted correctly and everything. They give you the file when you when you buy the game and download it, to load it onto the C64 Mini. Like they'll put it right in their advertising, C64 Mini compatible. That is so fucking cool. And it's one of the things that really puts the C64 Mini for me over the top, because that ability for where, it's a pure retro console. It doesn't really have any new abilities. It does not connect to the internet, et cetera, which is a good thing in my opinion. It doesn't do any of that, but it's still a fresh system. New games are made to this day. And trust me, play Organism and you're just going to be like, holy fuck. I mean, this is not just some, rehash of like a platformer or something like that. This is a brilliant game. And there's other ones from Cytronic Software that are great too. So you have the ability to play completely new games, which, again, there's still a community for the Commodore 64. It's incredible. It speaks to the power of the system. You can do that. And also, again, if you have ROMs of the any of the thousands of games that came out for the Commodore 64 originally, you could play any of those. In fact, in particular, one of my favorite games for the system is V. Now, it's, yes, V. When I say V, just V. As in V, V the Final Battle, V the miniseries, V the television, or V the television series, or V the series, right? The the classic kind of Nazi allegory by Kenneth Johnson that was all the wild rage in the 80s. I love that show. One of the best science fiction shows ever made. Not that 2009 remake stuff, even though that was pretty good. But the original 80s stuff, they made one game for it, and it only came out for the Commodore 64. And you could play that, and boy, I powered that up. What a brilliant goddamn game. I mean, like, I was awash with, just how much depth they put into that. Like, there's a little readout telling you what's happening on the mothership that you're in and everything. It's, like it's giving you reports. It's, oh, man. The shit they used to think of with these games, you really do feel that Wild West nature of the Commodore, of gaming on the Commodore 64. I'm so glad that the C64 Mini exists for other people to experience it. I just wish there were better fucking controllers. It's so bad. It's so bad. I mean, it's really hindering what is otherwise a genuinely great machine. I mean, you could do programming on this thing, right? I mean, you got the terminal, go for it. Have your time. You could be loading software onto it and everything. Oh man. I mean, it's so brilliant when you do that. And the other, the kind of the advantage to this is that, honestly, because some people will say, well, but I could do that on my PC at any moment. Hell, I could do it on my Android phone. I could do it, here, there, everywhere, whatever. I'll just use an emulator. Yeah, but here's another place where the C64 really shines, or the C64 Mini really shines. And the emulation is the most perfect emulation I've seen, bar none. It is perfect. And it's easy. Like, usually even on an Android phone, it's a pain in the ass. I've done it. To set up a C64 emulator, there's usually a few different steps you have to go through. No, not with the C64 Mini. It just goes, and the emulation is phenomenal. And that is no small task. And I've tried quite a few different games, including a lot of custom ROMs, and it just plays all of them beautifully. There's no sound issues. There's, none of that. Again, the only problem is those goddamn controls. Those joysticks. Just, they are sucking the biggest cock they possibly could. They're so bad. But otherwise, beyond that, and again, I don't like GameTalk to go much past 30 minutes. I think we're already past 30 minutes, but we're reviewing an entire console here. Beyond that, this is, beyond the joysticks, this is a brilliant little machine. Supposedly, Retro Games Limited is going to be releasing a full-size Commodore 64, probably why they're just calling it, you have the C64 Mini, like, probably part of the reason that the website is called the C64.com and not the C64 Mini is because they are planning on releasing a full-size version of the retro console. I would buy that in a heartbeat. I'd lay down a couple $100 for that, no problem. Whatever it took, if I got to get a couple more sponsors, I want that because I want the keyboard to work. I really do. And if they could come out with a better joystick for this thing, that would be awesome. But that may not happen. Admittedly, it might not happen, but boy, I really do hope that it does. Again, like the joysticks themselves, they don't say the C64 Mini on them. Whatever one you happen to, what you get in the box, and even the one that you get that's officially from Retro Games Limited, they all just say the C64. So I think they've always had it in mind to do a full-size replica. And again, I'm all on board for that. Even though I already have a Mini, I'll take a full size one, and if they could figure out how to, maybe the one software fix I'd love for them to do is to allow for more ROMs to be stored or accessed than one at a time on a USB flash drive. That would be great. So if we could get, and also it would be important to have another USB port, maybe two more USB ports. If we got a full-size Commodore 64, we could pull that off. We could have 4 USB ports. Then we could have 2 controllers. You could have, well, you wouldn't need the keyboard. So 3 would do, right? Because you wouldn't need the keyboard since on a full-size one, there'd be, you could actually hopefully use the keyboard. Otherwise, it'd be pointless to do a full-size version. But you'd want one where you could have the USB drive that has all of your software, custom software and ROMs on there to run. So, yeah, I think that this, if I was going to give this system a ranking, I would give it, I want to give it a 4 out of 5. If the joysticks were great, if the joysticks, that are just the one that it came with, or if the compatibility with other joysticks was up to par, I'd give it a 5. I'd give it a 5 out of 5 in a second, because the fact that this is such a versatile system, it's really a full-on computer. It's not just a retro console. It is a full-on computer. And the fact that you can buy new games, you can still be excited about things to add to it, and that you can add on games, even though not the ability to not add games, that could be seen as a feature, not a bug. I can appreciate that. I can understand that. I don't, and there's options, like there's classic to Magic, right? Where you can add on ROMs and even cartridges to any Super Nintendo or any NES, or any NES Classic or Super Nintendo Classic that you want, right? So, you can still get around that, but the ability to do that stock, and again, with so many games, it's really, really, with the Commodore 64, this is the one where that ability needed to be in the box. Okay, where you can add on games, your own ROMs, because there's just so many fucking games. There's so many. You really didn't have a choice as to where you can get a pretty good picture with the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic as far as, what games you need to play, right? And even then, Nintendo offers the Virtual Console on the 3DS. If your game doesn't happen to be on one of the retro consoles, you can easily get it, or hell, if you have a Wii U or whatever, you can easily get it on your other Nintendo systems. So, that's not so much of an issue. But with the Commodore 64, this needed to be. I think I'm still going to give it a 4 out of 5, just because of the quality of the emulation, the quality of the presentation, the fact that the terminal's there, that all of that's there. I gotta give it I'm feeling like I should just give it a 3 out of 5, but I gotta give it a 4 out of 5, because this was a real labor of love. They put I really feel like they put a lot of work into this, especially on the software side. They're still updating it. They're still coming out with new firmware, and so on. Really, if any other brand, okay, say like Atari or something like that, If they wanted to, even though I know Atari, there's like that handheld that's getting released, that's only released in the United Kingdom, or, in other parts of the world, they won't ship to the U.S., unbelievable. And then there's, the Atari, the VCS that's going to be coming out, that's supposedly going to be coming out, and so on. The Intellivision news is very interesting that's been coming out around about that. Apparently some ex-Nintendo people are working with the re-release of the Intellivision, which I'm excited for that. But bottom line being, any other brand, like if ColecoVision or, well, we already know that nightmare, but whatever it was, I don't know, the Odyssey, like if the Magnavox Odyssey wanted to get re-released, or the Odyssey 2 or something, Retro Games Limited, I'd let them do it, because I think they did a hell of a job with the C64 Mini. Yeah, it's a nostalgia play. Yeah, the games aren't exactly like, you're not going to, there's some games I think that are at the level of, say, your Legend of Zelda's, like I said, Sword of Fargal, or there's a few others that I could think of, and there's some really rare and really ingenious games on there. I don't want to say there's anything on there that's like at the level of Chrono Trigger or something, right? But there's some brilliance on there that's worthwhile. And particularly with the new games, which you can take full advantage of. Again, it's a very unique aspect within the retro console world right now. Like the new games, like I said, like Cytronic Software's Organism. Worthwhile, totally worth the $5, totally worth. It plays beautifully on the C64 Mini, and it's the best emulation you can get in the world right now for that. And so, yeah, I've got to give it a 4 out of 5. It's really, the 1 star taken off is just totally about that fucking joystick, because it's really just so bad. Yeah, I would have liked if the keyboard worked too, but I also understand at the same time that would be pretty much impractical. But where it would have been handy was, again, the fact when you open up BASIC, when you open up the terminal, it'd be nice to have something that I could type right there. And you can bring up a virtual keyboard, okay, at any point. And that helps, make things easy. And if you don't want to plug in, or if you have, 2 controllers plugged in, you don't want to plug in a keyboard or whatever, you can take advantage of that. But, that in and of itself is even really a pain in the ass sometimes to use. So yeah, again, those 2 points, yeah, they're kind of major. But at the same time, I sort of feel like maybe that's the reason that they only put 1 controller in the box, because they knew how bad the controller was. I'm kind of hoping for that. I was also hoping that by the time it got to America, 2 things would happen, because I knew that the controller, people were complaining about the controller previously, and I was hoping that would improve by the time it got to the States. It did not. But the software did improve by the time it got to the States. And it's significantly less complex and has a few extra abilities. So at least half of what I was hoping for in waiting, and not just, spending the extra $40 to $30 to get one, out of Europe sent to America, which would have been totally fine, because there's really no difference between the two. It was still worth the wait. And the biggest point in its favor is, you can add on whatever game, including new games, and the fact that, because one of the arguments against, like, why would you buy a NES Classic? Why would you buy a Super Nintendo Classic? Why would you buy any of these retro consoles when you could just, punch up an emulator on a PC, or, put an emulator on a RetroPie? Because in this case, the emulation is second to none. A computer, your smartphone, you take your pick of the fucking hardware. It can't do it with the level of perfection that it can't play Commodore 64 software games at the level of perfection that the C64 Mini does. Worth it on its own if you're a fan of that system, and I most certainly am. In fact, I'm tempted to go play some V right now, or Organism, though it's a little late at night for that. Yeah, you got to look for the new games for the Commodore 64. Some of these are just goddamn brilliant. Really, really brilliant. And they get to take advantage of a lot of more modern gaming ideas that, when you put it into an offline package and a classic graphics package, makes for really engaging gameplay. So that's a lot of fun to have that. And it's just cool to, I think it's hot, to message somebody on Signal or Telegram and say, yeah, I'm playing Commodore 64 right now. Sorry. Or not sorry, but come over, or I don't know, whatever. I think that's fantastic. So very well done. I don't want to say if I were to choose what my favorite retro console is, I need to mess with the Neo Geo Mini some more really before I do that. This is not going to beat out the NES Classic or the Super Nintendo Classic for me, but boy, it's close. I mean, it's really, really close to being to taking top spot, and maybe with a couple improvements, it might just take that top spot. I mean, it is unique in what it offers in comparison to other retro consoles, ones that are out there or even ones that are planned. Which, by the way, real quick on that before we wrap up the second episode of Game Talk. Still no announcement about the PlayStation. What games are going to be available for the PlayStation Classic or the PlayStation Mini, depending where you are. No announcement. We've got 4 or 5 games that they verified, and there's supposed to be 20 something on there. Come on, the thing's coming out in about a month. I mean, I already have mine pre-ordered. I'm ready to go, but let's get with it. Whew. Anyway, but the Commodore's or the C64 Mini is with it. I definitely recommend it. In fact, that's our last comment to make on it. I was really expecting, I've been pre-ordering all of these systems. I was really expecting these to sell out either because of popularity, like what happened with the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic, or due to like a limited production run because of the, shall we say, untried company that is Retro Games Limited that made the C64 Mini, or what's got to be a not cheap production process for, say, the Neo Geo Mini. I expected these things to just completely sell out instantly and people would be waiting if they could even get any more of them. That has not happened. You're still totally able to get your hands on a C64 Mini if you want to. And I think the Neo Geo Mini is still widely available too, even the controllers. I mean, I really expected those to sell out like hotcakes, but they haven't. So maybe the PlayStation Classic will be another situation where it sells out fast. I don't know. Or maybe, what Nintendo put out there was a special brand of Nintendo magic that no other company is really going to replicate. We'll see. So anyway, yeah, you can get your hands on the C64 Mini. It is available. It would have been great to hear that it completely sold out and they weren't going to make any more. I mean, I don't want people to not have something, but it would have felt cool to have one, and no one else or very few other people did. But no, there's plenty of them out there if you want to get your hands on them. So do check it out. In fact, I'll put a link in the show notes that will go through stuff.sexandsciencehour.com if you want to purchase the C64 Mini for yourself. If you want to get that second controller, don't. That's my warning to you. Just don't. If you want one, you're going to have to find them on eBay. In fact, those are the ones that seem to be selling out because I can't find any more on eBay right now. And there were very few left when I finally purchased one because I think a lot of people knew that the C64 Mini was finally coming out in America. And so other people were trying to get their hands on a second controller so that they could play some of these games in 2-player with whoever mattered. So, but don't bother. Wait for the firmware version that really allows for, a lot of maybe a PlayStation controller or an Xbox One controller to work with the C64, with the C64 Mini. I don't recommend spending the extra money for a second controller. The controllers are just not worth it. I'm going to keep mine, but they're just not worth it. So that's your only warning there. But otherwise, pick one up. Link is in the show notes to do so. And that'll wrap up our second Game Talk. And again, from now on, the Game Talks will be on the $5 Patreon tier. Okay, so you got to do $5 or more to get access to future Game Talks. And we've got some doozies coming up. I mean, some real doozies, some great reviews, some interesting news to talk about. It's all here for you. The Golden Stallion loves you and is on for you. And I'll see all of you on the other side. Woo!
Game over.